Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at Nori, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change.
Hello and welcome to the Reversing Climate Change podcast with Nori. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm one of the co-founders of the Nori Carbon Removal Marketplace. Today I have with me Rinker Buck. Rinker is a journalist, adventurer, and the author of several books, including The Oregon Trail, A New American Journey, and Life on the Mississippi, an epic American adventure that we will be discussing today. Thanks for being here, Rinker.
Great to be here.
Rinker, why do you do the things that you do? You performed what I understand to be the first passage of the Oregon Trail in about 100 years, and you built and captained a flatboat down the Mississippi River system. These are eccentric hobbies. Why do you do such things?
Well, I only learned after my Oregon Trail book came out that they actually have a term for this. It's called participatory history. And that has very little appeal to me. I'm just responding to the exigencies of life that come up. I wanted to do a book about the Oregon Trail, and I read and I do intensive research, and I tend to write books where here's what's happening to me today along the Oregon Trail, and here's what happened 150 years ago when the trail was in use creating America. So I do a lot of research, and I was reading my research one day, and what came up, but the Oregon Trail has not been crossed in an authentic way by covered wagon and mules since 1909. So I said, wow, it's 100 years, more than 100 years since anybody went across. And I grew up on a farm with workhorses and wagons. We even had a covered wagon as a kid. We were one of those eccentric families that collected old wagons. And
the
I said,
stories about your dad. He's quite a character and sent you on a number of adventures too.
Yeah, he was quite a character. So I said to myself, well, what the hell? I'm interested in the Oregon Trail. Why don't I take the Oregon Trail? That'll lead me to interesting places. And it led to, it sounds like I'm being boastful, but it led to a successful book. And then I decided to go down the Mississippi too, because in a flatboat, because during my trip across the Oregon Trail, it took us 4 months. And, it was an authentic trip. We didn't have pickup trucks following us with catered meals and all that kind of reenactor bull. And I learned that the crossing of the rivers was very, very important. And there was diary entries that I found in small towns in Oregon, stuff about carpenters who helped people convert their wagons to flatboats to go down the rest of the Columbia River because the wagons were all beat up after a 2,000-mile journey. And they said the pioneers proved, almost all of the pioneers who were largely from the Midwest, proved exceptionally adroit at building boats and taking boats because of their experience during the great flatboat era. And I said, wow, I read a lot of history, and I'd never heard of the great flatboat era. So I got involved in that, and it turns out the flatboat era, which was traffic between Pittsburgh and New Orleans right after the American Revolution, between the American Revolution and the Civil War, it turns out that they were the first pioneers, and that really created the America that we know today, and that the flatboat period, when thousands of people every year were building their own flatboats and going down the Ohio 1,000 miles to Cairo, Illinois, and then from there 1,000 miles down the Mississippi to New Orleans, with a lot of stops in between. It turns out that was the real frontier. That was the first frontier. America was a riverine country. We're a river country. And the frontier was a river, two rivers, Ohio and the Mississippi and all their tributaries. And that just fascinated me. So it just occurred to me, as it often occurs to me, things like this. Well, why don't I build a flatboat and just take it to New Orleans, you know? And this all got started, which I think you mentioned, Ross, that maybe you had read the book, but this all got started as a youngster, and I think it just became ingrained in me. My brother and I, when we were teenagers, I was 15, my brother was 17, we rebuilt a Piper Cub, an old Piper Cub, a $300 Piper Cub, in our barn in New Jersey. And then once we had it done, we said, well, what are we going to do with it? And the farthest we could go without having to take it apart again and send it by ship or something was California. So we became the youngest aviators, so-called, to fly coast to coast. And that's described in my book, Flight of Passage. And the point is, I'm just trying to answer your question. How do you get to be this eccentric writer and stuff? And to me, it's not eccentric. It's just what you do, you know.
It is what you do. It isn't common, though. It reminds me of the Laurence Olivier quip about method acting. I think he asked Dustin Hoffman, have you tried acting? You don't actually have to become the character. You don't actually have to do this, but you sort of have a gonzo journalism method acting. You're committed to telling this in the most authentic way possible, which is, seems like it take you 4 months living out of a mule-drawn cart, crossing mountains. Parts of it strike me as being quite perilous. Parts of it, I mean, most of it seems very uncomfortable. And it also, it doesn't strictly require, it isn't necessary, but it's a beautiful thing. Why do it that way, though, rather than desk research? I know you supplement your expeditions with lots and lots of research in a similar way, like reading Paul Theroux is often like this for me too. Like the guy reads a lot about what he's doing and also goes there himself. You don't actually have to do that to write a good history. Why do it that way?
Well, because all kinds of things occur to you when you get to the actual scene. As a journalist, I learned over the years, and it could even be just a toe touch, but it was very hard to write about a place or a major event unless you went there, unless you saw, you know, the boat where the captain was seized by pirates or whatever. And so for authenticity to occur to me and for me to feel I'm writing a truthful account, it really helps to go there. There's also just huge insights that you get by being on the scene, as opposed to just reading about it in books. So that the Platte River, which is very, very important in the Oregon Trail crossing, the pioneers followed the rivers. They followed the major rivers across the West. It's what's called a braided flow river, which most of the rivers in India are like that. It's a big, wide, shallow, muddy thing that in heavy rains breaks into what's called a braided flow, which means that when in heavy rains, storms, and the Platte River Valley is famous for its very violent thunderstorms, it breaks into all these tiny little rivulets, which make the river extremely wide and extremely various. And why was this important? Well, the biggest killer on the Oregon Trail was cholera epidemics. And there was no germ theory in those days. People thought that disease was caused by a kind of malaise in the air. And what happened was a covered wagon would come in. They would defecate all over the place where they camped that night. Then the river would flood a little bit overnight into the braided flow and flow downstream. And the covered wagon that was behind you, coming up to get to the same spot the next day or two, was ingesting water that had fecal matter, had dangerous waste matter, which is what causes cholera, the mixing of waste and drinking water. And so how was I going to understand that? How was I going to see that? And it really became amazing because by seeing the sandy soil along the Platte River, by understanding how the trail literally went right along the river, and the trail is still there in that space today, unchanged, and you're just riding right along the river. And then in the middle of the night, there was one night when I didn't park far enough away from the river, and sure enough, we had huge flooding. We got trapped actually near Bridgewater, Nebraska. We got trapped for 2 or 3 days because the river overflowed the trail and there was no way for us to get through. And it overflowed all the local roads too. So you're actually, you asked me, well, what's the advantage? You're actually participating in the same kind of ecological, topographical events that you're writing about. And you'll notice when you read my books, you feel like you're along for the trip. Well, that's because I took the trip. If I didn't take the trip, there's nothing to take you along except, a footnote from Professor Alonso or something.
Yeah, I've read other books. Like one of the books I read supplementally for this podcast is Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey. Have you read
They're
that?
amazing. Yes, I quote several. The fascinating thing about the Oregon Trail experience is that the women diarists were the best, and without women diarists, we would have been done. Most of the typical marriage in those days was an illiterate male who worked all day and herded cattle and did whatever, and a well-read wife who might have been a school teacher at some point. So the women diarists were the best and best writers, the best recorders. And Narcissa Whitman, who was a missionary wife, was the first woman to cross the trail and get through South Pass. And she galloped up and over South Pass on a side saddle. And side saddles are really impossible to ride, very difficult. They made women ride them because there was a belief that it was more delicate and gentle and better for the dress for her to sit sideways. And this beautiful image of Narcissa Whitman and her friend galloping up over South Pass on side saddles, and she was a great recorder of the trail. And because she sent letters and diaries home, which were published in the local newspapers, what happened in those days was in the mid-19th century, a letter was almost public property. It got passed all through the family and shared and whatnot. And it was Narcissa Whitman's letters home that were published in the New York State papers that really opened up the Oregon Trail, because the big fear, the big bugaboo that the American public had was that it was not a place fit for women. It was not a place fit for women and children. And then she gets to the rivers, and one of the fear was the savage Indians, the depiction we had of them in those days. Well, then she gets to the river, and the Indians come across in a boat or in a canoe. In one place, she saw pioneers being crossed the rivers the children were crossed the rivers on the backs of Sioux braves. They were great swimmers. And so the tribes tended to meet the covered wagons when they had to cross the rivers, because they were great boatmen, and they also knew they could make a little money or get some trinkets or whatever by helping the pioneers across. But it was those letters published in the early 1840s from Narcissa Whitman that opened up the trail, because everyone realized, well, we can travel with our families. And you don't really learn all of that until you get on the trail and see it. And that riding up over South Pass myself is unique experiences, the Continental Divide. And there's a monument there to Narcissa Whitman when she came through, and I think it was 1842 or 1843. You just feel it intensely. You're there, you're seeing it, and that inevitably creeps into your writing and makes it a better book.
I think so too. As much as I like the book Women's Diaries of the Westward Journey, and there's so much that's fascinating about it, mostly the thing that sticks with me is that they'll not discuss their pregnancy at all, and then say a baby arrived today.
Yeah.
Like, really, you've been doing this horribly uncomfortable, dangerous journey, and then also you're pregnant or became pregnant on this trip. It was
considered indecent to discuss a pregnancy, and just so yes, so we have good health today, things are good, our second baby arrived on Tuesday, blah, blah, blah. But,
How?
and nowadays we make such a big deal of it. We have reveal parties and all this stupid stuff. The other things that were fascinating about taking the trip itself is you pick up things in local diaries and local histories and history rooms and stuff that aren't in the major history books. And that leads you to go to other sources for research. One of the things about the trail is that it was a very religious event. There was something called the Panic of 1837, which lasted for 15 years. It was extraordinary. It was much worse than the Great Depression or anything else. There were half the banks in America failed between 1837 and the early 1840s when the trail began. And what would happen for mutual security, adventure, faith, whatever, whole churches would leave together. And people were more organized according to their churches than they were even to their towns. And there was still a lot of it was a time of a lot of religious ferment, the Second Great Awakening, it was called, and a lot of differences between religions. So you have these hilarious things. And, I would get to the same place and look around and see what they were describing. But it's like, arrived Plum Island today, found a very favorable campsite along the Platte. Alas, discovered that a group of Presbyterians were camped nearby. And these were Baptists, of course. Packed all our stuff back up, proceeded 2 miles downriver to have our own place to camp.
Wow.
That literally happened. That was how America was then. Can you imagine, like if you got to Motel 8, and I don't know,
Yeah.
looks like it's full of a bunch of Methodists. We can't stay here tonight, But that's so you learn the detail, the textual, the tactile detail that makes a book really good. You learn it by going along on the trail. And also, I got to see how dangerous it was. I mean, when we went down the Rocky Mountains on the border between Wyoming and Idaho, that's the western face of the Rockies. You descend this very steep trail that descends to the Bear River in Idaho. And it was perilous. I mean, we could easily have died there because we had to go along this narrow path on a cliff. On the left side of our wagon was a 300-foot drop. And, I said, Nick, this is, I said, don't worry if we go, or I could probably get off the wagon, but he wasn't going to be able to because he was on the steep side. And I said, don't worry, I'll come back for you. He said, don't worry about that. Just come back for my dog, So.
God, that section of the book is truly, I got nervous just hearing you describe it just now. I can't imagine people having to do that in large groups with perhaps less ability to be rescued if anything happened. Although it sounds like if anything bad happened there, you'd probably be out of luck anyway. So maybe it's not actually that different from back then.
Yeah, but you're on the actual trail. You're not standing at a highway marker 5 miles from the trail or something. You're on the actual trail and you're seeing the dangers. Another thing, and at a certain point, I have some interesting insights on what all this means for global warming. But at another point, we got to a place called Willow Springs, about 30 miles in the middle of Wyoming. Remote area. Hasn't changed at all since the pioneers were crossing in the 1840s and 1850s. And there just happened to have been heavy storms along the Sweetwater, and Willow Springs was flooded. We couldn't get through. We literally couldn't get through. But fortunately, I had done enough reading to know that there was something called the Seminole Cutoff. The Oregon Trail wasn't really one trail. It was a series of cutoffs and new trails made according to what changed each year. And so we had to head sort of due south until we got to the Seminole Cutoff. And then I took the Seminole Cutoff back to the regular trail. But fortunately, I'd done enough reading and knew about it. We got incredibly lost in a place called Spike Peak, Wyoming, where the trail at that point, after you leave the Platte, you join it's a large tributary that goes through Wyoming called the Sweetwater River, which is one of the most undisturbed and beautiful rivers in the country. But there had been flooding. It was a high water year when we crossed. So there was flooding ahead of us, and the trail was flooded out. So we had to just take off cross country and in this very, very high remote desert. And it took a while, but I managed to get us back on the trail by figuring out that there had been a cattle drive coming through. And literally following the footprints of the cattle drive back to a paved road, because I was pretty sure they were taking the cattle to trucks on the highway, to a paved road. And that led us to a ranch ahead and back to the Oregon Trail. So, but that was something that happened to the pioneers a lot. The trail was wiped out by flooding, heavy rains, whatever. And you had to improvise. You had to be fearless and clever and read the signs of nature to get through where you wanted to go.
And yet both books make a point of describing your work as not reenactment. And in fact, both books have sections where you have conflicts with people who are more reenactment minded than you yourself are. And you're going through change environments. So we're going to get to this environmental history of both of these,
Sure.
the Oregon Trail system and also the Mississippi River system. But if you had gone at it in a reenactment kind of way, looking for the old way it might have been, it both would have been less informative. And also your work is supposed to chronicle these changing environments and how these things are memorialized and experienced now as well. And so if you had done it in purely that old school fashion, you probably would have missed a lot of that, I think.
Yeah, well, we did it in a totally authentic way. We went on a covered wagon, we went on a flatboat. I didn't have any other, modern things along, and, but no, I don't go for reenactment because reenactment is totally phony. It's based on a premise that you can actually physically recreate by uniform wearing or the right clothes, this kind of thing, the conditions and the mental attitudes, and actually relive that history. Well, you can, of course. The world has changed, and what reenactors is, they tend to focus on very obsessively, focus on little details of uniforms and so forth like that. In the belief that will give them some kind of insight. Well, it gives you no insight. You really, the Civil War was a horrible tragedy. There's nothing to celebrate it as a reenactor, and what they celebrate is death and dying. There's guys that blow, the guys that get shot by a mini ball and whatnot, and that's their specialty. The other problem with reenacting is it tends to be historically recreated, or an attempt to recreate history in a way that promulgates myth and propaganda. So like the Mormons, for instance, every year the Mormons take these huge, long covered wagon drives, and they're phony because they're catered meals, and they pull a big tractor trailer in for showers at night and all that kind of stuff. Because the Mormons, they trace their Hagera across the Mormon Trail, which was really just the Oregon Trail. They trace that exodus to Utah as the creation of their religion and distinct culture. And so they're trying to promote
the new
that.
Moses, right? It's supposed to be an exodus from Nauvoo to Utah.
Yeah, it was an exodus. And the hilarious thing is, at various points along the Sweetwater, they have, which is kind of the holy land of the old Mormon Trail, they have these summer camps, and all the Mormon kids have to come up from Salt Lake and all the different places where Mormons are and camp out there for the summer. And they push hand carts around. They have to wear period dress. It's really hot out there, and they have to wear the women have to wear these long dresses, and the men wear these Western getup, and they celebrate their religion. And a lot of it is just comical and really, really silly. And I wrote about that. And the interesting thing was, and I knew I worried that a lot of Mormons wouldn't like it, but that's what you see a lot. The Mormons actually control about 150 miles of the trail in the most spectacular place in the South Pass section. Okay, well, so at Devil's Gate, this beautiful stretch of the Sweetwater River, there's this huge Mormon camp, and I described coming over the peaks and looking down, and there's this immense camp of kids, and the Mormons use it to celebrate their religion, to promote their religion. They have a museum there, and how great Mormonism is and everything. And I was sure that a lot of them would be offended by what I wrote. I didn't write it that way deliberately, but how could you miss that when you're crossing the trail? And so after the book came out, I got all these emails and letters from Mormon kids. And they said, as far as celebrating our religious history, the only thing we learned at Mormon camp, the forced Mormon camp every summer at Devil's Gate, is how to have sex with our Mormon boyfriends, So, reenacting, I mean, it brought them there, and I guess it's a valuable thing to the church leaders and everything. But for the rank and file of the faithful, it's just an act. It's just something that you put on in the same way we have a nativity scene at Christmas.
But the handcart trek is mythologized, at least partially, because wasn't it an error of judgment of Brigham Young's to send them out at an unseasonable time that was badly provisioned, and it became like heroic in a way, but it was kind of bad leadership, in my understanding, is what actually happened.
I described that. I think it was the 1846 or the 1847 handcart experience, and hundreds died at Martin's Cove until they were finally saved, because they were like the Donner Party crossing the Sierras. They left late. They made a lot of mistakes. They weren't provisioned properly, and it was a classic instance of a disaster for religion, something that shouldn't have happened and should be celebrated as a failure of leadership that killed a lot of people. But of course, the Mormons have turned that into a kind of resurrection story. And there's all kinds of myths and funny beliefs. There's one mass grave just beyond where they were trapped by the snows that is now sort of a kind of a Mormon temple in the middle of the desert. So, and again, you see, I wouldn't have known about this, and I wouldn't have realized to write about it as dramatically as I did unless I was along the trail, actually seeing it.
What did you notice along the trail about how things have changed environmentally? One example I have in my head, maybe you agree with this and maybe not, or maybe it's relevant or maybe not, but reading Stephen Ambrose's Undaunted Courage about how many animals the Lewis and Clark expedition could shoot from their boats they didn't even have to go anywhere. They'd be like, we killed 60 elk today. And they didn't even seemingly leave the river to do so. That is obviously no longer the case. The buffalo are gone now, but surely there's many other things that you notice that some things are good environmentally, like the Platte River system is no longer producing huge amounts of cholera that are killing many people. That is no longer a thing. We know how to address that. But there's also many, many things that maybe you've seen, and along the Mississippi River as well, that are signs of industry in decline, of pollution, and potentially of cleanup too. What trends have you seen?
It's both good and bad. All right. So the Monongahela River, which is one of the tributaries of the Ohio that flows in from West Virginia and is very clean and everything nowadays. The so-called Monongahela Valley, the Mon Valley, was where all the U.S. steelworks, steel plants were. Massive forges, coke plants, etc. In 1973, when the Clean Water Act was passed, there were only 3 edible species left in the Monongahela River. The cleanup since then has largely been precipitated by the fact that the steel mills closed, which is a tragedy. But you can now catch 150 species of edible fish in the Monongahela. So it's a great success story, and it's much, much cleaner now. On the other hand, as you get further down, on the Ohio and on the Mississippi, especially, the companies, the big corporate entities that run transportation and carry all the goods down there, still about a third of our economy exit to the world economy through the Mississippi River. But the industries that dominate that transportation are filthy, polluters, lazy, abominably led. Everyone likes to worship what's his name, the sage of Omaha,
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett. Now, he owns the Northern Pacific. The Northern Pacific rail lines are the filthiest places in the world. They take all the old creosote ties down, the wooden ties underneath the rails, replace them, and then create a huge pile of creosote, literally almost an acre of creosote ties just thrown on the side of the railroad tracks, which, by the way, runs right along the Ohio and in the west, the Platte River and so forth. And it's rotting creosote. It's one of the most toxic. The creosote is a treatment that they put on the ties so they don't rot. It's a petroleum-based thing, black, ugly stuff. And they leave acres and acres of these along the railroad tracks. When you're coming down the Mississippi and the Ohio, the barge companies, these big tugs are going by and they're pushing 30 or 40 barges at once. If an old barge gets rusty or gets damaged or whatever, they just push it over the side of the river, let it rot out and sink right there. All the companies, all the tugboat companies, the big source of fortunes in the Midwest that have big tugboat operations. If a transmission blows, they throw it overboard. If an engine blows, they throw it overboard. And it's so severe that in certain spots, and they're marked on the maps are pretty carefully marked, you're coming to a port or a repair center for the Ingram Barge Company or whoever it is. And as you get closer, what happens is your compass starts going wild, starts going around in circles. There's so much metal down there. There's so much iron down there at the bottom of the river that they've thrown out that it affects, it's called deviation, but it affects the accuracy of the compass and starts going around in circles. So you could tell by how the compass is behaving whether you were passing a junkyard, an impromptu junkyard along the river. So those are two examples, okay? The fish came back and the pollution, the hard physical pollution of industry is everywhere that you see. And they're beautiful rivers and it's a beautiful lyrical trip to go down them, but the irresponsibility of our corporate leaders is just staggering.
You also detail on the Oregon Trail, and you can see this I don't know if you watched the Taylor Sheridan 1883 series. Did you see that by chance?
Yes.
Yeah, there's scenes of people, they're just leaving behind huge amounts of valuable items at various river crossings. There's just no room to bring all the stuff that they want to bring. And apparently there's just debris fields. You could just follow trash all the way across the Oregon Trail, essentially.
In fact, after after late 1840s, when the trail traffic picked up, especially in the 1848, 1849 gold rush period, you navigated to California or Oregon via the debris field. And I quote this in my book, my Oregon Trail book, and it's hilarious. I mean, you're crossing the desert, and there in the middle of the desert is a huge ship's anchor. Why did someone decide to bring a ship's anchor, or a bathtub? And there was a guy named Langworthy who was very interesting, who was a diarist. And he said he concluded from very early on in the trip that he wasn't going to keep all his baggage and all his clothes and everything, because when he needed a new suit, when his old suit, he probably wore it for a week or two and it got kind of filthy and smelly. When he needed a new one, he just went through the debris piles that he found along the trail and found a clean suit, you know. And he wasn't joking. That's really what happened. So yes, America as a serial polluter had its origins very early. So, but you know, the thing about climate change that's fascinating to me, that struck me as I was crossing the trail, and it struck me again, given some of the aberrant weather that I found along the Mississippi when I was going by flatboat, was that one day we were traveling along in Nebraska along the Oregon Trail fairly early in the trip. And the Platte River Valley in Nebraska is the first treeless expanse of prairie after the Rockies. There's nothing to stop the storms coming through. And the Platte River storms down through Kearney, Nebraska, and all the way east to Omaha through Grand Isle and places like that are some of the most violent in the country, probably the world. And there's stories of whole wagon trains. Every wagon was blown over, stuff like that. We camped several nights during really violent thunderstorms, and and the wagon would literally shake and rock back and forth from the explosions of the lightning hitting the soil and also the wind. But the thing that struck me, this moment of insight I had, was, wow, there are actually prototypes for the impact of climate warming. You know, we've lived through this before. And so sitting in my covered wagon at night, and there was a really violent thunderstorm, which was something that no one had prepared me for, and something that I just didn't know that I was going to quite confront. But it led to really good parts of the book, not only what was happening to us, but what was the experience of the pioneers. We've lived through not climate change exactly, but the physical and meteorological impacts of climate change. For instance, we crossed during a high water year, and there were crossings where we expected to get across the river. We couldn't do it that day in that spot because there was so much flooding. So we had to go up another 50 miles and figure out a way to get across. We would be riding along the trail and get this really violent thunderstorm, and we had to sort of pitch the mules along in a very quick way up to high ground so the wagon wouldn't get flooded underneath. We had windstorms. I described one windstorm just near kind of approaching Scotts Bluff, Nebraska, and the sandstorm was so violent that I couldn't see the road any longer. I couldn't see the road we were following. And the only way I could navigate holding the mules is I was holding the lines like this. I looked straight down, absolutely straight down. For some reason, in a really violent sandstorm, you can sort of see straight down. And I could see the dim outline of the grass shoulder of the road. And I just kept the mules, just kept the wheels right on that grass shoulder, right on the edge of that grass shoulder. And I knew I was still on the road. You would never, you know, there was another fascinating thing that happened. We crossed something called the Little Colorado Desert in Wyoming, which is sort of south of Casper. And you're kind of crossing the open desert towards, and this is real desert, towards the Green River. And it's called the Little Colorado Desert, and we crossed it in one day. And there's very large wild horse herds in there. And all these rivers are marked on the map, but they're dry gulches. There's only water in there, you know, a day or two a year after a rain. But one of the things you learn about water is that the river is just the visible indication on the surface of water that's underneath. Okay, so there's a lot of huge amounts of water underneath. So what happens is I just started noticing all these prairie falcons, these peregrine falcons, these, apex predators of the desert circling around in a certain area. And then we'd get up close and I noticed, oh, there's a lot of prairie dogs around here, etc. And what was happening was the prairie dogs, who of course burrow into the ground, establish a colony near the dry river gulches because there is water underneath there. And they have at least a source of water that they can dig to. And also there's enough water certain times a year that there's vegetation around for the prairie dogs to eat. Well, the prairie hawks, prairie falcons, feed off their big source of feed is baby prairie dogs. And so from a distance, I'd be trying to figure out on the map, how am I going to get across and figure out where I am and know, because it's an area where there really isn't a trail. You just have to head off cross country by compass heading. And then it would be useful to know, well, all right, there is a dry gulch up ahead. And in one afternoon, I was able to learn, okay, where those prairie hawks are circling, that's the dry gulch. And it's about 2 miles away and it's a little bit off. So we're going to steer in that direction just to make sure we hit that and we have a cross point. And I get there, and where the hawks were was exactly where the dry gulch was, and was exactly where a prairie dog colony. And I figured that all out myself. I didn't, later on, I confirmed this by reading in biology books and stuff about wildlife and where they congregate there. You could tell from the tracks of the wild horse herds where water was, where there were rivers and stuff, because they had to stay close to the rivers. And we camped at a couple of these spots in Willow Creek and stuff, south of Casper, along a very, very remote stretch of the trail. And so I learned that you're navigating according to where the water is, and you can teach yourself to navigate when you don't really have any other visual references to help you. And I guess the insight I had was that we've been through this before. The pioneer experience, the homesteading experience, was really, in a very literal way, a search for water. You had to stay along the rivers for water and for vegetation, for firewood, stuff like that. And then as the pioneers crossed, and I read about this in the book, they realized that a lot of pioneers were going to return to stretches of Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, where they saw these beautiful fields of wildflowers. You drive through these wildflowers, they're amazing, the scent and everything. Because the pioneers who were experienced farmers knew that if there was an explosion of wildflowers in a certain area, it would only be there. They would only be there because there had been water, there had been a heavy rain. And it's sort of like in the Australian outback, every 4 years you get this explosion of beautiful flowers when they occasionally get a rain. The seeds never leave. The ability to grow those plants never leave. So the pioneers knew they could come back here. And how did they make it work for farming? They dug wells into the Ogallala Aquifer and put in irrigation ditches, which now, 150, 200 years later, we're drying up the aquifer, But I guess just surviving the incredible storms that we survived, understanding that I could always navigate no matter how hostile the environment, understanding there was a unique weather situation that I described in my Mississippi book. As we were traveling down the Mississippi, there was a very unique weather setup that came that year, although it's becoming more and more common. There was a dip in the jet stream above us and was holding the storms about 50 miles off from the course of the river. But there were these pop-up storms that would be generated by all the storms that were 50 miles away. And we're driving along the river, and all of a sudden this huge thunderstorm would come, totally unpredicted, nothing that was in the weather reports the night before or whatever. And then the big problem, and during those kind of storms, you're going down the river on a boat, a flatboat, it's more dangerous to try and land the boat on shore than it is to stay in the middle of the river. And so, but I didn't want to run into something, and there were curves and everything along the river. So I just assumed a compass course, pointed the boat into the wind as much as I could, and followed exactly what I saw just before the storm hit, that compass course. And it was amazing how well we survived those so-called pop-up storms, and they were very violent. And after a while, I just became, another storm, let's do it. So it just seemed to me that there is in kind of the DNA of Americans, coping mechanisms that we learned during conditions which weren't necessarily caused by climate change, but they were impacts as severe as the climate change we're starting to experience today, and that it's in our DNA. There are coping mechanisms. Presumably, although it's easy to be a pessimist, presumably we really are going to bring on alternative energy and stop pumping all this carbon into the air, et cetera. And it'll take 50 years or something.
Are you quasi-adapting the Frederick Turner thesis to climate change here? Our
I
frontier
guess
has
I am.
adapted us to a culture of adaptation.
Yeah. So the Turner thesis was that everything in America is just a replay of the frontier years. Yeah, I haven't exactly thought it through, but you're going along, you're crossing the plains in a covered wagon, and the nearest town might be 30 or 40 miles away. You're on your own. It's just your own ingenuity and resourcefulness is keeping you alive. And suddenly a real bad storm comes up, and similar experience on the Mississippi River. And what struck me was, well, everybody's panicked about climate change, and we're going to go through all this hell. We're going to have coastal flooding, because of the rise of the water levels and so forth. And it's going to be uncomfortable and maybe even tragic. And then I just got caught in the most violent thunderstorm of my life. I had to move to high ground. I had to drive 3 mules and 2 wagons, a half mile away up to higher ground so we didn't get flooded. And I coped. And the pioneers coped. Now, it was a much less complex world then, I suppose. But for some reason, it gave me hope, and it also gave me a notion that that there were prototypes for this experience, and we can rely on those prototypes.
I have mixed feelings on it. On the one hand, I like that humans are less exposed to extreme climate events than ever before in history, just in terms of development and our material safety.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I really like about your books because your journeys force you to notice things and to be an active participant in your environment more than just caring about the weather for, oh, it's going to rain today, I should change my jacket. Like, it actually influences the course of major decisions in both books of what actually is going to happen and how to remain safe and to be aware of your surroundings like that. I think that noticing is actually a really important thing beyond just the practical adaptation. I think spiritually, it's a good thing to be plugged into how the world around you is actually still very wild, and how you actually need to pay attention to it. It's not something you can just take for granted for stability's sake. That's in some ways an illusion. And also, even if it were not an illusion, I think there are good spiritual reasons for wanting to pay attention to it or needing to pay attention to it. I think that it would be good for us not to forget that.
Yes, and it would be what taking those trips reminded me of, and what the books are really about, is start noticing things. Noticing things. I mean, is the grass long here or is it short? Are there wildflowers here? Has the emerald ash borer gotten to this part of the country or not? And by notice, and you have to do that when you're on a covered wagon trip or a flatboat trip down the Mississippi, because that's the physical environment you're in. You're not in a big, tall skyscraper somewhere protected and sort of isolated away from nature. You're not in an air-conditioned car, etc. And so you have to notice those things because that's your environment now. In a covered wagon, you're pretty much exposed to the whole environment. Another thing that people need to appreciate, and I think you get from my books, and I have a big long screed about this in my Mississippi River book.
There are several screeds though, so refresh me.
Yeah. Is we depend on what we consider normal life is extraordinary luxury, and we don't need it. Okay, everyone said, you'll never make it down the Mississippi. You're going to die because the sun is too scorching. This, that, and the other thing. Well, it's bull. When you get out on the water, there's always a breeze out there. You're moving along, et cetera, et cetera. And at night, it was always possible to find kind of a breezy area or some kind of place where you could survive the mosquitoes and the heat and all that stuff. If nature calls and you have to take a crap in the woods, you do it. This fetish that we have of sanitary, luxuriant conditions is not necessary. We're taking the resources we have, which are finite, and applying them to all kinds of things. I just was reading about these stupid data centers, which they need to keep all these video games going and everything. Well, it's ridiculous. I mean, they're polluting rural areas of the country. They're located along rivers because they need the water for the coolness, etc. And for what? For some kids staring at a video game on a cell phone. I don't get it.
That kid should be rebuilding a Piper Cub in his barn.
He should be rebuilding a Piper Cub, or I live in Amish country and I go out every day after I finish writing and I cut firewood, stuff like that. There's just what happens when you take a trip like this is you realize that there are deeper pleasures and deeper enjoyments, deeper luxuries in life that don't include all the sort of physical pampering that we surround ourselves with. And but the biggest thing is just being aware, see what's happening around you. That's what these trips taught me.
Sure, there were many parts where you maybe not considered quitting, but fantasized about being somewhere more comfortable. But I'm sure now that it's fully behind you, the memories of those trips, even if you hadn't written books that were part of your career, might still make it worth it. Because how many people get to do something like this? I'm sure parts of it were extremely difficult, and you document many of them, but I'm sure you're glad that you did them, right?
Yes. And one thing is you shouldn't overplan, and you shouldn't, sit around and come up with lists and everything. Basically, if you read my books, you see I just left.
There's Deus Ex Machina just helping you out all over the place, seemingly. Just things fall into place.
And the world is more receptive and gracious out there than you expect. Now, of course, the way I'm traveling, everybody wants to help you, and you get quite a fan base going. But to ask yourself, oh, how am I ever going to make this? I mean, taking a covered wagon across the Rocky Mountains is a bitch. It's difficult. But each day is just, we just got to get over that place to this place, the next place. You just have to have a sense of abandon, and I'm no longer living in a culture where I have to have a permit for everything.
One of the trips that I did, as I rode my bike from Phoenix to Los Angeles a long time
Hmm.
ago, and it was a 10-day trip. I did, self-supported by myself. And the part that I most loved about
Did you come across Death Valley on that route?
I didn't go the Death Valley route. No,
Yeah.
but I wasn't super far from it either.
Yeah.
I ended up
Hmm.
going like the 29 Palms north of
Hmm.
Joshua Tree way,
Hmm.
but I love that I just had to make my miles and not get hit by a car. And that's where my mind was. I wasn't thinking about I could also be reading a book or writing something or seeking another job or I my
Hmm.
all I did was not die and keep going. I felt like we
Hmm.
don't have a lot of places where we're not being distracted in that way. I think that's really a powerful, good thing for me at least.
All you have to do is not die and keep going and conquer whatever problems you had. Like, you planned for water here, it wasn't there. What are you going to do? Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
All you have to do is solve contingencies, not die, and keep going for 10 days. Okay. The next thing you know, you're in LA, you know? So, yeah, I just think we live lives too insulated by luxury. And what these trips taught me, and I'm going to go on another one. I'm building a wagon now. Uh,
I was gonna ask you, I'm like, surely you've got something up your sleeve. How could you
well,
not?
I got something else up my sleeve that I'm doing now. I'm writing a new book about all my experiences over the years with a very similar group of people, which is the Amish and the Mennonites, and they still live that very simple way.
Oh.
But no, I'm building in the old days you'd call it a gypsy wagon, but my kids tell me that we can't use the word gypsy anymore. So I'm calling it an Irish traveler's wagon.
Hmm.
But it's sort of a domestic wagon. It'd be pulled by three mules, and it's got a bed in it, and a wood stove. I'll have a little insulation in there. I can probably live almost year round in most parts of the country. And it's being built by the Amish for me in Tennessee. And I'm going to take it. I've never seen the whooping crane and sandhill crane migration along the Platte River at Grand Isle, Nebraska. I want to see that. I have friends in Red Lodge, Montana. I love that area of Montana. So I'll get up there. So that, like middle Tennessee to the Absaroka Mountains in Montana over a period of a couple of years, maybe 3 years. I'm just going to do it. Just, I don't even have any idea for a book about it. Just go and see what happens and see how I survive. And, you know, uh, I've got the team of mules assembled and I'm all set for that. And I guess what the earlier trips have taught me is, don't worry, just go. You just got to go, you know, and your protections and everything you need defines itself as you go along. And I think that's what we're going to see with climate change. Um, I don't think it's a smart thing anymore for people to buy beach houses, and I don't think ecologically it's a good thing. And the government uh, is finally taking away one of the incentives, which is cheap insurance. We had government subsidized insurance coverage. Well, that's slowly going away, and it should go away. But we shouldn't be building along our coast. We shouldn't, in California they build, on sandstone cliffs overlooking the water. Well, it looks beautiful, I guess. It's nice to wake up in the morning and see Pacific Ocean. But why are we doing that? It doesn't make sense, and it causes a lot of damage. So I think what's going to happen is people are going to learn to cope with things like rising sea levels. Um, I don't know how we're going to cope with the fact that we're depleting the aquifers underneath the earth, mainly for agriculture, at alarming rates. Um, but I have hope that from taking these trips, I have hope that you can encounter almost any circumstances, learn from it, and get past it. So, you know, I guess that's where my head is at.
I think that's a good place to be. As we're coming close to the end, I want to ask you one more big question that hopefully
Sure.
won't open up too enormous of an answer, but I think you
Mhm.
had a really, both books put you in a position to understand and experience the United States in a very unique way. I think you do a good
Mhm.
job of not being, observant of its faults, but also celebratory of it. I think you walk
Mhm.
a very correct kind of line, because there's a version of this that is propagandizing or so critical that we're just rotten to the core and there's no redemption possible.
Mhm.
Are you hopeful about the trajectory of the country? I'm not even talking about the election. I mean
Yeah.
more as a country, are we living up to, or in the hopes of living up to what we set out as our goals or our values, or not really?
Well, one of the things that you notice very heavily when you take a trip, okay, across the Oregon Trail, which kind of cuts through open, beautiful country away from civilization, and the places where it crosses civilization uh, tend to be nice towns or whatever, or the Mississippi River, which is kind of like railroad tracks. They're away from everything. You get a different perspective. But one of the sensations that overwhelms you a lot is, all of this stuff that's happening in Los Angeles, New York City, and Washington. All these debates over migration and global warming and taxation and this, that. It doesn't affect you when you're way out here. It's not a part of life way out here. People are still running their farms, running their ranches. So you can get lulled into a totally local, based on nature mentality of just what you're seeing that day. And in the end, you realize the politics they don't really matter that much. The politics, what is the real difference between Democratic policy and Republican policy on this, that, or the other thing? So my perspective, to answer your question, is distorted. I've removed myself from all that and realized that all the political battles raging in Washington and New York, LA, whatever, they're not necessarily a part of the life you lead deep in the natural flyover country. So it's easy to be hopeful. It's easy to be hopeful. And yes, I am hopeful, though, but it is appalling. It can be appalling when you get out there and realize how little education there is, how little appreciation of how complex the cosmos is that people reflect on. So I'm hopeful, but I'm also spoiled. I've placed myself in environments where you can sort of ignore that all those problems are there. It's very romantic. It's very satisfying, just sailing down a river in a simple wooden boat or plodding across the desert with mules, or plodding through beautiful farm country with mules. You've kind of abstracted yourself from all the modern worries in a lot of ways.
Where do you want someone listening to track your stuff down? Is it going to flatboatpatience.com? Is that where you'd want people to go?
They can go to flatboatpatience.com, but I'm not that heavy and big uh, a web participant. No, go to Barnes and Noble or preferably your local independent bookstore and just find the books. The books are what make the trip significant. If I had taken a trip across the Oregon Trail, first in 100 years that was authentic, and just done it, it wouldn't exist any more than a tree falling in a forest that no one hears exists. But it's the book that dignifies the experience and makes it available to a wider audience. No, I would say go find the books. That's the most important thing. And I'm not saying that just to sell books. I'm saying is that there's a great amount of integrity to the book experience, and it's it it is the expression of one soul and one experience that's very important. I'll tell you a story. One thing, but people have to learn to be tangible and be immediate. So my son, in his late 20s, was traveling in a very remote part of Arizona, because he participated in a group that helps a group of Pueblo and Hopi Indians out there. And so he's traveling along, and they get out of cell phone range and whatever. And the GPS is no longer accurate. GPS is saying traveling on road, So he pulls out of his backpack a map and says, oh, we're okay. We want to go along here. And then when we get to sort of this intersection where we can see the river, we want to bear northeast a little bit. And the other Gen X type people who were along with him go like, boy, you're a weirdo. Who uses a map anymore? And I've talked to a few kids about this, and you actually meet kids who go, oh yeah, I wouldn't, what is a map? I couldn't read a map. And of course it seems so simple to me. But my son, I guess largely through being exposed to me and the kind of events I would expose him to, knew how to take a map and tangibly connect it to the surroundings that are going by you in the car. And what a lot of this automation and digitalization and everything, the GPS says, turn right on this such and such a road in 500 feet, And you're just looking at that screen. Your relationship is to the screen now. It's not to the actual natural surroundings you have. So the best thing people can do is, as I said before, get in touch, observe what's out there, and fortunately we're still surrounded by nature and there's a lot to observe.
I think it's good advice. I love your books. I would even revisit them, which is not true for many books that I read.
Mm-hmm.
There are also audiobook versions that are quite good too, if you prefer that.
Well, they can listen to the audio. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Rinker. I know you took a little bit of a flyer doing a show like this, but I'm glad that we were able to chat.
No, it is great to chat, and good luck with it. And I don't know, I'll do another book someday and we'll do it again.
That'd be great. Thank you so much for listening. If you could please subscribe and give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, that'd be much appreciated. It helps us get our content out to more people. You can sign up for our newsletter at nori.com, follow us on social media, and we will catch you next time.